This is risky, but I have some data jokes that we... Data science is 80% preparing data and 20% complaining about preparing data. Yeah, not that great. What's the difference? I think you've probably heard this one. What's the difference between an introverted data person and an extroverted data person? Yeah, the extrovert stares at your shoes. A SQL query walks into a bar, walks up to two tables, and asks, anyone got it? Can I join you? Yeah. I think maybe we'll just get started. Since I'm bombing. Actually, a few more thank yous. By the way, but thank you to you, because this day is going really well, and I'm just really grateful that people are spending all this time on this beautiful day inside. So I should say to our kind of financial supporters, like a huge note of gratitude. The Knight Foundation has been a supporter through the years, is supporting this year. We're very grateful to everyone who's been working on getting us funding, and here's to the years ahead. Dean Elizabeth Hudson of the College of Arts, Media, and Design, my boss, has been supportive. Beth Minot, Dean Beth Minot of the Curry College of Computer Sciences has also been really supportive. And actually, Beth goes way back to Georgia Tech days with Nick Diakopoulos, and so there's a long sort of lineage of support for this intersection between computation and journalism. Let's see. Oh, I want one side note. You may have noticed these two peculiar artifacts that sit out in the atrium. One is a poster of a movie, and one is the front page of the New York Times. And we brought those over from the journalism school. One sort of, the poster sits in various rooms, and there's a tiny story about that. But let me tell you about the front page of the New York Times. If you look at it closely, it's from exactly 160 years ago. And it is the front page of the Times the day that Abraham Lincoln was reelected. And one of the things you might notice from a sort of UI perspective, from a layout perspective, from a storytelling perspective, if you looked at it carefully, it is just data tables. That's all it was just data tables. There's no story, there's no viz, there's no single point of entry for the eye. It is just a mass of actually very well ruled and lined data. And you think about where we are now, where there's a needle pointing somewhere, or Nate Silver's telling us, a snappy headline about the election. And it's just interesting to think about the history and the context in which we sit, in which this conference sits. And so we brought that over. But that's the actual page. And we're in election season. I know a lot of people are quite nervous, and so we wanted to at least acknowledge that. We do actually have an elections kind of like therapy session coming, I think, tomorrow. I think. Does anyone know? Jason Radford's running it. So anyway, I hope people participate in it. But without further ado, I just want to introduce doctoral student and media entrepreneur Caleb Okereke. Caleb and I are working together. Caleb's running an amazing site called Minority Africa, but he's also joined us as a doctoral student. He's going to introduce Aaron. So thanks, Caleb.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Caleb Okereke. I am from Nigeria. I'm the founder and editor of Minority Africa, as my great advisor John just mentioned. I'm also a brand new PhD student here, so just week 8, which is very new. But I have the great privilege of introducing Aaron Sankin to you this afternoon. And I think many of us know Aaron. Right now, Aaron is working at the Marshall Project as a data editor on the data team. Before that, as we also saw today, Aaron was at the Markup, where he was covering algorithmic discrimination, and I think Julia kind of set us up pretty well with some of his work earlier. One other fun thing that I found out is that people say award-winning a lot, but Aaron is actually an award-winning journalist. And so I was looking at his like blogspot website, which is the only one with a .blogspot website. But he has won an Edward R. Murrow Award for his reporting on predictive policing, and as well as an Investigative Reporters and Editors Philip Mayer Award for an investigation into racial and socioeconomic disparities in internet service pricing. The last thing I want to do before I go is, I found out really fun things about Aaron yesterday because we're chatting at the reception, and I want to leave you with one truth and one lie, and then he will tell us which one of it is true and which one is a lie. And the very first statement is, Aaron Sankin has been to my home country, Nigeria, twice. Okay, first statement. The second one is, Aaron Sankin used to be a theater critic and started out writing reviews on plays. So Aaron will tell us which, but just ponder on it. Please give a warm round of applause to Aaron Sankin.
Hi, Caleb. Thank you so much. I will let you decide which of those is true and which is a lie after you listen to my speech. Hopefully you can guess which one. So, hi. My name is Aaron Sankin. I am a deputy data editor at the Marshall Project. We are a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to doing hard-hitting reporting on the criminal justice system. My role at the Marshall Project is helping steer our data team, originating our own projects and working with other journalists across the newsroom to add data analysis to their reporting. Before that, I was an investigative reporter at the Markup, which is now part of the California focused newsroom, Cal Matters. And the Markup was founded by Julia Engwin, who we heard from a little earlier today. She recruited me into a role where most of what I did was serving as the traditional investigative reporter on teams with data journalists, helping them conduct investigations that were fundamentally based on data. So today, I continue in my long-standing personal tradition of basically doing the same thing that Julia already did, just later and a little bit worse. So in both cases, while the job titles were different, the role was essentially the same, helping data journalists turn their analysis into stories. That process, and what I've learned about how to do it effectively, is what I want to talk about today. What I've learned is that the words reporting side of data journalism isn't just dealing with the fact that if the scoop of your investigation are the correlation coefficients of your regression model, and you phrase it like that, most readers will have already stopped listening to this sentence the second I said correlation coefficients of your regression model. There's also another problem, and that is dealing with a fundamental problem that everyone working in data needs to contend with. But to explain how that works, we're going to have to get down to basics. So let's start at the beginning. What is data? I said we are starting with the basics, and this is as basic as we can get. Also, this is my only slide. This is the entire presentation right here. So what is data? Data is an abstraction. It is some kind of measurement of the real world that has been in some way quantified. And this quantification process has benefits. You can run it through a computer algorithm. You can run it through a math equation. You can count it on your fingers. You can feed it into the mechanisms of your bureaucracy where it can be widely understood and interpreted by lots of different people within that bureaucracy who hold different interlocking job functions. And making information digestible to a bureaucracy is great, because bureaucracies are often where power lies. So if you want your story to have real positive impact in the world, making it so bureaucracies can understand it is a really important way to go. Sometimes I would publish a story, and people on social media would be like, oh, everyone already knows this. And I would say yes. Through their own individual experience of existing in the world, everyone in, for example, low-income areas knows that their internet service is crummy and expensive, which is a thing that I spent like a year of my life reporting on, and which I will talk about in some depth in a few minutes. But using data allowed us to quantify it in a way that's more digestible to people in these regulatory and advocacy bureaucracies like the FCC, for example, which is what allowed that story to have greater impact than if we just didn't rely on aggregating information through quantification. See, the plural of anecdotes may not be data, but for the people whose lives generate those anecdotes, they may very well be pointing in the same direction. And yet, when we convert the world into data, something is lost. When I was doing investigations at the Markup, I kept having this realization. Over and over again, I would get halfway through reporting out a story, and it would hit me that I was writing a story that had already been written. My beat was, in essence, algorithms. I was writing about all these different decision-making processes, from predictive policing systems to online advertising portals to broadband deployments, specifically about how these systems were failing marginalized people. And after digging into each of these systems, I discovered the same root explanation for each one of their problems. That explanation is also how you get into trouble doing data journalism. It's the part of data journalism where the role of everything that sits around the data analysis becomes paramount. I realized that essentially, over and over again, I was rewriting the first chapter of a book. And that book is called Seeing Like a State. Seeing Like a State is a book by an anthropologist named James Scott about why certain big, ambitious government projects like China's Great Leap Forward turned into epic humanitarian disasters. Scott, and who this is like important context, also wrote a book called Two Cheers for Anarchism, if you want to get a sense of his politics. So Scott argues that it all comes down to a fundamental problem with the very concept of data. And Scott starts the book with this tour through 18th century Prussian forest management techniques, which is weirdly, and I promise this is relevant, the story that I realized I was constantly retelling. So the TLDR on this whole thing is that the Prussian government had decided to start managing forests scientifically, classifying each piece of their forests using the metric of how much wood it contained that could be cut down and sold. Since forests were encoded into data based on how much of a certain type of wood they contained that could be sold, the people managing the forests optimized them to maximize the amount of wood they produced. So if you've ever heard of this idea called Goodhart's law, which is this idea that if a measurement becomes a target, it stops being a good measurement, you might have a sense of what comes next. So they cleared out the underbrush. They planted just one very lumber-heavy species of tree in orderly rows because that was a way that they could take this tree and they could cut it down really easily and maximize lumber yield. And within a couple generations of trees, well, I'm not gonna try to pronounce the German word for what happened, but they call it forest death. Because as it turns out, abundant underbrush is really important for the health of trees. Creating monocultures of evenly spaced trees leaves them extremely vulnerable to things like pests and diseases and natural disasters. Scott's argument is that governments, and really all bureaucracies, have a natural inclination to quantify the world into data, for all the great and helpful reasons that I just mentioned. But in the process, most of the information that can be gleaned about that particular part of the world that is being observed is lost. So a richer, more nuanced understanding of what a forest meant was certainly held by the people who lived there, but their local knowledge about what should be done with the forest couldn't be observed by a bureaucracy in all of its complexity. The government could have asked locals about their opinions on the management of the forest, but even that would have had to be encoded into data and abstracted into a format observable by its bureaucracy. So for Scott, the loss of this local knowledge is the core problem of all bureaucratic systems. They can only see in abstractions that strip complex nuances from the world, and therefore they can only act based on that myopic view of the world. David Eads, who runs the Marshall Project's data team, has this related saying that says, "Assumed data is how an institution lies to itself." And I can't really argue with that. What I realized, though, is that this same dynamic doesn't just exist for governments. It exists for everyone who uses data. So in addition to those long-dead Prussian arborists, there was also another institution vulnerable to this same problem, and that institution was me, doing the data journalism that I did every day, putting me, and probably also you, I am sorry, in the same predicament as every government. But here's the thing. Like, I am a journalist. I don't only have to fiddle around with data. I can also report. And in that reporting process is how rich, nuanced, local knowledge can make its way back into a story. Incorporating local knowledge is what transforms a data analysis into a piece of journalism. If local knowledge is lost in abstraction, it can be gained back through reporting. Creating a feedback loop in the reporting process, correcting problems related to that process of abstraction. And this feedback loop needs to exist in every single step of your analysis. So I want to talk about a story that I had written at the Markup, largely because I have only worked at the Marshall Project for like a month, and if anyone knows where the bathrooms are in their office, please let me know. But I want to talk about a story that I worked on at the Markup, and we can see, and I can kind of show how this feedback loop functions at multiple different steps in the process. So one of the things that I really learned from Julia here is that one way to think about data reporting is essentially what you are doing is an experiment. You have your data set, and you are going to use it to prove your hypothesis or disprove your null hypothesis, as all the crazy kids are saying these days. So having a theory of what you're trying to do is crucial because, one, it makes you less likely to be p-hacking your way into finding illusory connections if you're doing a statistical analysis. And two, it keeps you focused on answering one big question. If you're trying to maximize impact, it's often really important to focus your reporting on giving readers a big, singular takeaway. And that comes from posing a big question and then answering it. And the cool thing with reporting is that your theory can change. In fact, if it's not changing a little over the course of your project, you are probably doing something wrong. So a few years ago, I did a story at the Markup called Still Loading, which started with a data collection mechanism pioneered by some researchers at Princeton that showed how to scrape internet service provider websites to collect the speeds and the prices that they were offering to folks at different addresses. My reporting partner on this story, Leon Yin, and I decided that we wanted to use this method, but at first we didn't quite know which question we wanted to answer. I immediately started out and decided I wanted to figure out if we could use this data about the service that was offered to all these different addresses to determine if cable companies that had franchise agreements with municipal governments requiring them to offer high levels of service across the entirety in a city, to the entirety of the addresses in a city, were actually doing that. So I started reporting that out, talking to everyone I could to learn everything I could about these sorts of franchise agreements. And while that was happening, Leon was also doing another really important part of designing this sort of data reporting experiment, a viability study. So think about a viability study as a form of reporting where you are lightly poking at the claim that you eventually want to make. Leon did our viability study by looking at one internet service provider, AT&T, in one city, Green Bay, Wisconsin. Once he got the results, he noticed that AT&T was charging the same price for different speeds of internet service, which we thought was really weird. That seemed like a weird way for a company to set prices. And we didn't understand why they would do this. So I started doing reporting. I started talking to connectivity advocates and industry experts and found an organization had done a small report on this practice, which they called tier flattening, a few years prior. This reporting, which was based on our viability study, reoriented our full reporting project. It's a feedback loop. It's letting the data inform what questions you ask, and then using those questions to influence your assumptions about the meaning of the data. So let's say you've done your viability study, and you've decided on your question. Now you have to analyze the data. How do you do that? Well, that's another question for the feedback loop. Take classification. It is always the worst part. It's terrible. You think it's not going to be bad, and it's what is bad. The decisions that you have to make about classification shouldn't be done in a vacuum. So in our broadband investigation, we had to figure out a framework for showing disparities in speeds. Should we analyze them on a linear scale, or should we sort each speed into buckets and then analyze them that way? This turned out to be a reporting question. So I started asking around. I talked to an academic who told us that people's experiences of connectivity are uneven, with lots of fluctuations in overall network usage. What mattered, he said, was the minimum speed that someone's connection was likely to get, which isn't advertised, because ISPs aren't like, this is how slow your internet can be, but that can be broadly inferred in broad swaths using advertised top speed. So as a result, connections within broad bands are going to be broadly similar. So highlighting small differences, they said, would be misleading, which is why we used buckets. The benefit of using reporting to guide your analysis is that if you talk to the right people, you can draw on their local knowledge and avoid this seeing like a state problem. So let's say you've collected your data and you've done your classification. How do you know that the things you're seeing represent what is actually happening on the ground in the real world? This is where you take your findings and try to match them up with real people's experience. Our broadband data had addresses, and the speeds that they got were available to people at those addresses, along with information about if someone at a given address was already a customer of that internet service provider. So using LexisNexis, we found phone numbers associated with each address, and I made hundreds of phone calls asking people about their experiences with their ISP to see if what we saw in the data that we scraped from these ISP websites reflected what was happening in the real world. And let me tell you, if you want to fundamentally change your relationship with telemarketers and have a lot more sympathy with them, I recommend making like 800 phone calls in a single week, because everyone hangs up on you. So what happened is that we found this woman in New Orleans who was subscribed to crummy, slow AT&T internet service. She had tried to call up AT&T asking for faster service, saying she was willing to pay a lot more for it, but she was told that faster speeds were just not available in her neighborhood. And that was confirmation of our story. That was confirmation of our data. We drew on her local knowledge, and it was a great anecdote that we could put in the story. Now, if this person had said she was actually getting super fast internet from AT&T and our data said otherwise, it would have given us a strong signal that we had some fundamental problem either in our data or in our understanding of what the data meant. And that kind of leads me to one of my favorite data reporting tricks, is showing people visualizations of your data and then asking them what they think about it in real time. So I would show connectivity advocates in all these different cities where we mapped the broadband speeds, these maps showing the geographic distribution of high speeds versus low speeds. And basically they all said, wow, this really looks like a map of our city's racial demographics. And then we said, that's really interesting. And that became the thesis of the story. I wanted to draw on their local knowledge of their communities to interpret our analysis, but also point out if anything about our analysis seemed weird or unexpected. And if you record the interaction while doing it, like Zoom screen share is really your friend here, sometimes they will have emotional reactions that provide good quotes for your story. You can get a lot of people to say a lot of profanity. It's great. It's like top tier. But they also give you really important context for your findings. So let's say you have your data analysis, you have your anecdotes, you're confident in all of this whole system. What's like the one step left in doing data journalism? Transparency. So when you're doing data journalism institutionally, you're supposed to offer transparency into your methods. And this is something that often seems like a really technical process. But really, at its heart, it is just as much about anchoring your analysis to the real world through external processes as every other part of this process that I have described. Now, my sense of how to think about transparency for data reporting projects was really clarified by this really fantastic paper by a philosopher at the University of Utah named C.T. Gwynn. And his paper is called Transparency as Surveillance. And the thesis of transparency as surveillance is that the primary function of transparency into highly technical or specialized projects is that it forces experts in a particular subject to make their reasoning accessible to non-experts. But by definition, the thing that makes someone a non-expert is that they can't understand the thing in question on their own. The problem, argues Gwynn, is that transparency limits what experts do only to things that can be publicly justifiable to a lay audience. And he also acknowledges this transparency is crucial for keeping institutions, powerful institutions to account. But this is a problem that is fundamentally in tension in his article. And the issue here is that as a human being, a lot of your decision making is going to be an intuitive combination of all the knowledge that you have kicking around in your head and all the experiences you've lived in your life going up to that point. Decision making is complex, decision making is multifaceted, but when you declare it in a methodology, you are basically encoding it into data. That comes with the same problems that I talked about earlier, shaving off the nuances that get lost in the process of abstraction. Gwynn's pathway towards solving this problem is by separating out different types of transparency. By doing this, you'll see that laying out your methodology isn't doing just one thing. It can be doing multiple things, speaking to multiple audiences. And in some cases, what you are doing is actually providing transparency. But in others, what you are doing is building trust. And those two things are different, and they should be approached differently. So Gwynn defines two types of transparency. There's assessment transparency, where details about processes are made accessible to outsiders. And then there's also reuse transparency, which is making it possible for someone to replicate or directly build on your work. Gwynn's separation of these two types of transparency is helpful because it made me realize that it's crucial to be thinking about assessment transparency and reuse transparency separately. So reuse transparency at its core should be very explicitly about helping other people do similar stuff in the future. If someone wants to go in and rerun your numbers to prove you wrong, that is cool. I love that for them. I hope hot tears stream down their face as they rerun all your numbers and they find you were correct. Like, I wish I only hope that happens all the time. But the primary effect of making it possible for that person to try to do that is contributing to the goal of assessment transparency, which is building trust in your audience. Reuse transparency, on the other hand, should be as simple as possible, given the constraints of the thing you're trying to help someone else do. Assessment transparency should be about building trust, and a lot of that trust starts with yourself. By actually writing down everything you're doing and why you think you did it, that's going to help you spot errors just as much as programmers will often find ways their code could be improved by going through and rigorously documenting it. Transparency is, in most cases, going to be the performance that you put on, a performance that builds out the character of the author in the minds of readers as someone who is thorough, sober-minded, and here's the key, trustworthy. Just a note, I was a theater critic, by the way. So in that broadband story, we selected as our universe of study the highest population city in each state that had one of the 4 ISPs that we were studying. We laid out that selection mechanism in the methodology. And we did that because I had read a bunch of other news stories about digital redlining, and I saw that ISPs were, 1, making arguments about the cherry picking of cities, and 2, making arguments about how the issue was actually about the urban-rural divide. And I got really annoyed because I thought both of those arguments were being made in bad faith. Did the methodology have "I got annoyed" in there? No, it probably should have. But it did detail the reasoning for the decision, which built trust with readers that I was being deliberate in every decision that I was making. And Gwyn's suggestion for building trust in terms of assessment transparency is a thing that he calls indirect calibration. Indirect calibration is when you trace a line of trust through overlapping disciplines which can be effectively evaluated. So what does this mean? His example is basically that since bridges mostly don't fall down, he trusts engineers. And as a result, he trusts the material scientists whose theories the bridge engineers' designs are based on. And those material scientists' work is based on applied physicists, whose work is based on theoretical physicists, and so on down the line. So like an example is like, if you're using a statistical test, you can explain what other sorts of things this statistical test has been used for. Highlight how your findings line up with the work that's already been done in journalism or academia. Place yourself into this larger lattice of trust people necessarily have to have in this human endeavor to better understand the world. And this performance of hooking into a variety of traditions that have worked pretty well is not just for show. It also forces you to mimic the forms of these traditions in ways that will hopefully help you not be wrong in the same way that they hopefully helped all these other people who use them throughout the years also not be wrong. And a cool thing about separating reuse transparency out from assessment transparency is that focusing on reuse transparency gives you a framework for pushing the impact of your reporting beyond the standard investigative form. After we published that broadband study, I was having a conversation with someone from an organization called the California Community Foundation, which is a connectivity advocacy group based in LA that published a similar analysis around the same time we did. Their analysis was done manually and was smaller in scale, just collecting internet speeds and prices just in Los Angeles, and by having someone manually log data from an ISP's website rather than go through a massive scraping project. And their findings were basically the same as ours. There was tier flattening happening, and it was screwing over people in lower income and predominantly non-white areas. But the methods they used were very similar for what I did for one of the other initial viability tests we did for my story, which was just me spending hours clicking around on Google Maps at random to find addresses in a given city, and then typing those addresses into an ISP website, and then logging those results in a spreadsheet. When I talked to the California Community Foundation people about their study, we spent like 20 minutes just commiserating about how that process sucked in every way possible. And in order to maximize reuse transparency, I realized that the key was to lower the bar. The idea was to make it easier for the next person doing what you did. If the next batch of folks get to see further because they're standing on the shoulders of giants, you can build them a stepladder. In this case, what we did was make a step-by-step guide showing people how they could do the same manual sort of data collection to evaluate connectivity disparities in whatever city they wanted to look at without needing to have any real programming experience. The goal was to drop the technical bar to zero. The key was identifying the problems they would have during that process and providing them with simple, straightforward solutions. For example, a big problem was getting a random sample of addresses to test and joining them with demographic data. It took us months to figure this out, and the process involved hitting census APIs and like a whole bunch of stuff like that. So we worked with Stanford's big local news, and Cheryl, who runs that, is over here. Thank you. We built this tool called the United States Place Sampler that gives a random sample of addresses from any municipality you want in the country. Also, this is available. It is useful for lots of different things. If you need addresses, just United States Place Sampler, anyone can use it. And then, in addition, with some help from some of the folks behind Census Reporter, we utilized a trick in Google Sheets that would allow people to instantly connect any address with its demographic information. And we also wanted to make sure that anyone could do this. So we ran the guide by educators at the high school and undergraduate level and asked them for tips to make sure our guide was suitable for their students. And this reuse transparency guide is written much, much simpler than the, I think 30-page methodology that we published in conjunction with the story itself, because that methodology was all about assessment transparency. The moral of all of this is to say that even if what you're doing is investigative journalism, do not limit yourself to the investigative form. Some projects are perfectly suited to be told in an anecdotal lead sitting on top of an inverted pyramid structure, but others can have more impact if done in other forms. And deciding on that goes back to having a hypothesis, not just about what you expect to find in your data, but how you want your story to change the world. And I know, Barf, I'm sorry, change the world, but this is actually a useful framework, and you probably don't ever have to say the phrase change the world out loud if you don't want to. But you can ask yourself, what is my hypothesis for impact? Basically, if what you're doing is identifying a problem, how best do you nudge the world into a shape where it can be solved? And I'll conclude here with an example of a new thing that my team at the Marshall Project did that I think is really cool. And I was only tangentially involved in this, but I just love to shout out when my colleagues do good work. So a thing that many people have noticed over the last almost decade or so of watching US politics is that Donald Trump has a talent for constantly saying things that attract media attention. I know this is controversial stuff. But the effect of this is that most of the really notable and outrageous things that Trump has said get pushed out of the news almost immediately. And also having a really high-profile politician repeating the same things over and over and over again is going to convince people that they're true, even just by the sheer fact of repetition. This means that even on one singular issue, like immigration, it's kind of hard to keep in your head all of the things he's said and their impact, because it's just one thing replaced by another ad infinitum. And we had found, he said some variation of claims that immigrants raise the crime rate in America at least 675 times over the years, which, by the way, is not true. So how do we deal with this? So we had some extremely talented data journalists on my team at the Marshall Project, took a corpus of every single political speech that Trump has ever given and used machine learning algorithms to pull out the ones about immigration and then cluster them into general topic areas. And this is how it worked. So they scraped all of Trump's speeches from rolled call. They then used a binary classifier called Roberta to determine if each segment of each speech was about immigration or not. They then used a sentence transformer to cluster the semantics of each immigration-related statement in 700-dimensional space to see which ones were the most related to each other. And then the lead data reporter on that story, on a flag, went through all the clusters to manually do categorization, describing what each cluster was referring to as a general theme. We then reran that entire set of statements back through the binary classifier around each cluster to decide if each claim that Trump had made belonged into each one of those clusters that Anna had defined. And then a team of Marshall Project journalists did a fact check on every type of statement. See, extremely cool. It was a really cool project. And this allowed us to do fact checks on over a dozen of the themes that Trump has hammered on the most on immigration and over his time in politics. And there have been lots of other fact checks of Trump's statements on immigration, but they've largely been driven by the latest news cycle. There's the border caravan or MS-13 or whatever the immigration flavor of the month story is. And what's the problem? What was the problem? It was difficult for people to get a full sense of Trump's statements on immigrations over time. What's the impact hypothesis? Aggregating them over time would allow people to get a better understanding of his full position on immigration. The solution here happens in people's heads because the problem was one of understanding. The data part of this, the clustering, the aggregating, is all extremely cool. But it's also just a larger, but it also is just part of a larger feedback loop of reporting. a feedback loop that's necessarily going to be present in all data journalism. But if you want to do it right, I encourage you to occasionally stop and think about it. Everybody, thanks for listening. I hope some of y'all found this useful. I think we have a few minutes left for questions, so I think we can move on to those.
I have a mic here for questions.
Thank you. This is a really interesting talk, and yeah, exactly the kinds of things I have been thinking about myself. I had a kind of difficult question maybe, which is, I'm coming from a quantitative background and I'm doing like data-driven investigations, but yet you're speaking of trust and expertise. Like, to what extent are data journalists or even the industry of data journalism contributing to the public's over-reliance on statistics as like a infallible, like always accurate, not biased, not abstract, not based on abstractions of data quantity. Because I think in general, like people tend to trust, numbers more than, let's say, anecdotes, or trust statistics over, other qualitative methods. So yeah, that's just my question.
I mean, I think a lot of it, like it's tricky, right? Because I feel like that inclination to really want to trust stats and numbers and stuff and not really deal with the fact that so much of that analysis is indirect or probabilistic is something that's baked into the public and baked into human nature. Like I'm reminded of the needle, like when the New York Times had the needle around election stuff. Like, I remember thinking even at the time, I was like, why is the needle vibrating? It's stressing me out. I hate that the needle is vibrating. And then eventually, over time, I was like, no, the vibration is good because it's vibrating around a margin of error. It is showing uncertainty. The sense, the nervousness, the needle stressing people out. It wasn't the needle stressing people out. It was the fact that what's going to happen like that day is unknown. So it's really hard to do, and I think a lot of it comes back to like approaching, as much as journalists can affect this, is like approaching what you do and how you describe what you do with humility. And like, there's something to be said of being like, I can't answer this question. Like, and this is a thing that is more common in academia, but it's like real fun to do in journalism, is just be like, I'm sorry, that was outside of the scope of the investigation. I can't respond to this. But I think just being, like, having humility in what you can say and being willing to just be like, this is a question that I wish we could answer, but I cannot answer it. And you just got to explain to people that there are reasons that you can't answer it. And like, maybe in your explanation of saying why you can't, someone will look at that and be like, oh, I know how to solve that. And then they'll build on it, maybe.
One thing that I was really interested to hear about in your process behind the broadband story is how you sat down with people with the data and showed them the data. I think that was really inspiring for me, as I'm primarily environmental and climate reporter, and I haven't been able to put this in practice yet, but I think the opportunity to help people understand the data by sitting down with them is a really cool idea. But I was wondering, I see that as kind of a aspect of like service journalism. I was wondering like what you've learned through doing that process, or if you think about it as service journalism, the way you can help people understand the data like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I was not so much of thinking that particular thing as service journalism, simply because like I was giving, like, the only people being served in that moment was the person I was interviewing. But I think it also kind of can give you ideas and give you, like, one, it just gives you like further reporting questions, but it also gives you ideas about how to later present your data in ways that resonate with people. So if people are like, oh, I wish I could zoom in more, or like, I wish I could I wish this had, I don't know, like labels on it so I could see neighborhoods or see streets or something like that. Those questions can kind of inform the way you later do that presentation. I think at the time I wasn't thinking of that thing as service journalism, but in ways like it is, because a lot of times those people that you're talking to are people who are advocates and activists and really involved in the community, and you're giving them basically like a sneak peek of what you have to do. The issue is that you have to like be responsible for that, because journalism is also, as anyone knows doing a data analysis, like sometimes you get most of the way through and you're like, oh no, I screwed this up, gotta fix this. So like when you do that to those people, you also have a responsibility to go back and be like, okay, I showed you this thing, it's not totally right, it's actually this, do you wanna see it again? And usually the answer is like, no, you're so annoying. But you do have that responsibility of, as your reporting process is also spreading information, to be like thoughtful and responsible about how you deal with that. But like I cannot recommend enough of showing people visualizations and letting people experience learning that same thing that you learned when you saw the results of your experiment for the first time as a reporting technique. Try to do it in everything now.
Okay, one last question.
Thank you for the great talk. I think yours and Julia's talks really go together. She talked about the introduction of the scientific method into reporting, and you've talked about essentially the introduction of mixed methods into reporting. So I'm wondering, in your experience, have you also seen changes in the news consumption side of things? Are news consumers be thinking about the news in more of a socially scientific way? If so, like what is doing that? And if not, is there a way that we can educate the public to nudge them in more of a socially scientific way of consuming the news?
I don't know. I have not really noticed that in terms of like how the average everyday news consumer is doing it. The one thing I would say, and this is maybe like a decade old, is I do feel that there was a kind of like heyday of this like real like core Facebook era conspiracy theories, and there was this sense and a push towards sending people and giving them resources where they could go out and debunk these conspiracy theories. You'd see something like Snopes or something like that would have this big database of all these conspiracy theories, and they would go to run the conspiracy theory through Snopes and see if there was a debunk. And I think in a way there is that like can kind of, in my head, I kind of see that as a connection of people being like, I am a more active consumer of news, and being like, I can go and I have this kind of source of truth that I can reference against. I think the danger is that there are a lot of things that seem to people to act like they could be debunks of conspiracy theories, but often they're just spreading conspiracy theories, and people's assemblage of their own information is fairly piecemeal. So I think it would be great if we could get readers to be thinking more like scientifically when they read an article. But even like, speaking for myself, a lot of times I will just read some article online, and the reaction a lot of times is emotional. It's a reaction because that's the framing that, especially social networks that are geared towards creating emotional reactions are presenting you things to make you mad, to make you upset, to make you have all these feelings. And that's gonna override your kind of logical brain. So I think we're seeing maybe two things happening at once, is people maybe getting a little more critical around their consumption of news, and at the same time, a distribution mechanism that's just trying to shoot the like hot rage straight into their veins. So.